I am now on the MTK hotline, and I'd like to welcome back to the show one of our favorite guests. He's our resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King. He's also the author of the fabulous book, Rock'n'Roll Unraveled. From the north of England, Mr. Derek Shelmerdine. Derek, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be back, and what a really interesting topic to talk about. John Lennon's Lost Weekend. I mean, so contradictory. The accounts of it just vary so much depending whose version you're listening to.
Right, and I don't really know much about it, and I'm not sure my average listener knows a lot about this time period in John's life. So I was hoping that you could walk us through some of the key events of this period. I know there was about 18 months from 1973 to sometime in 1975. So if you could take us back and touch on some of the highs and lows, as well as you just said, some of the different perspectives of this time period. If you could, take us back to the beginning.
Okay, well, the name Lost Weekend comes from a 1945 movie, Ray Milland movie called The Lost Weekend. And it's all about the time when John and Yoko split up and John went off and had an affair basically with May Pang. But it's not really quite like that. I mean, May Pang worked for Alan Klein's ABCO in 1970, so she was the personal assistant for John and Yoko for several years before it all started happening. And then in the latter part of 1973, it started to go wrong with John and Yoko. Yoko was an artist, and she felt she'd lost her privacy. John was drinking heavily, had a lot of problems at the time. And effectively, Yoko told John to leave. John would be 33 at this point, and May Pang about 23. And what happened when Yoko kicked him out was she suggested very strongly that May Pang have an affair with John and they go off together. And she partly did that because she really didn't see May Pang as a long-term threat. And I think she saw it partly as an insurance policy to stop John sort of shacking up with anyone else while they were separated.
That's pretty, I guess, open-minded. I can't think of a better word, of Yoko. She's basically setting her assistant up to basically chaperone John. Is that a good way of putting it, do you think?
Sort of yes and no, I think, because it was more controlling, I think, than being a positive thing. I mean, it's interesting. When you look at May Pang's view of what went on, it's very, very different to the story that John told after they got back together. In fact, in 1983, May Pang wrote her own version in a book called Loving John. And I saw an interview with her, and she said she wrote the book to set the record straight and to dismiss some of the myths that surround it. Like, John wasn't miserable for 18 months. In fact, it was a very productive time for John. Yoko didn't send John and May Pang off to L.A. They chose to go. And the general thought that John and Yoko reunited at Elton's concert is also not necessarily quite how it was. And famously, if John was so intent on returning to Yoko, why did Yoko send Paul McCartney, to L.A., where they were living, to talk John around into returning to her at the Dakota building?
Yeah, I didn't realize that Yoko had asked Paul to do that. I didn't know that. Also, apparently, this period of John's life was also a time where he kind of patched it up with his son, Julian. It actually was a good time for their relationship. Is that right?
Oh, very much so. I mean, that was one of the really positive things to come out of it. John was back with Julian. In fact, in a Times British newspaper interview with Julian in 2009, there's a couple of quotes here that really contradict a lot of how John and Yoko portray it. And what Julian says is, "We had a lot of fun, laughed a lot, and had a great time in general when he was with May Pang." And he also said, "My memories of that time with Dad and May are very clear. They were the happiest time I can remember with them." So, it wasn't all bad at all. And in fact, May Pang has said that John wasn't doing the constant heavy drinking. He had bouts of heavy drinking with people like Micky Dolenz. May Pang actually took the last known photograph of John and Paul because it was at the time of the Pussycat recordings in the March of 74.
We're speaking with Derek Shelmerdine. He's the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King. Today's subject is John Lennon's so-called Lost Weekend. Derek, what were some of the highlights, musically speaking, for John Lennon during this period?
Oh, it was a very productive time. I mean, he started to record the Rock'n'Roll album in the October of '73. That was with Phil Spector. And that actually is a story all on its own. I mean, Spector ran off with the tapes, and John finished the recording in New York City a year later. But that is a great album of his. And he also worked with a lot of other people. He produced Mick Jagger on a track called Too Many Cooks Spoil the Broth with Jack Bruce on bass. And John and Paul played together for the last time. That would be the 28th of March 1974 in a jam session that was later captured on a bootleg called A Toot and a Snore in '74. And Stevie Wonder and Harry Nilsson appear on that. And of course, he famously produced Harry Nilsson's Pussycats album in the summer of 1974. And Mal Evans, who was the Beatles roadie, right, and May Pang are both credited as production assistants. And the drummers include Ringo Starr, Keith Moon, and Jim Keltner. And another Beatles flash from the past was Klaus Voormann. He was very involved in The Lost Weekend. He was playing bass on that particular album. And then, of course, you've got, towards the end of 1974, John Lennon's Walls and Bridges album. May Pang is credited as the production coordinator. And on Number 9 Dream, she provides the backing vocals. And there's actually a love song to May Pang on the album, which is called Surprise, Surprise, Sweet Bird of Paradox. Also on that album, a track called Ya Ya, Julian, his son, plays the drums. And John famously wrote 10 of the songs in a week back in the summer of 1974. So it was a very positive time. He also famously got thrown out of the Troubadour Club in the March of '74 when he was heckling the Smothers Brothers. So he had his sort of ups and downs, as it were.
Yeah, I think most people think of that time period just for that one instance getting thrown out of that bar. Derek, before you go, I want to talk just a little about Yoko Ono. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't want to pick on her. I know a lot of people have picked on her, but I've heard stories over the years that Yoko and John's meeting was basically fiction, that Yoko was hanging out at the Apple building trying to basically land a Beatle, and that she had her sights set on Paul McCartney. Now, I have no idea if any of that's true. Can you set me straight on that story?
Well, again, there are lots and lots of different versions of this. But what certainly seems to be more often than not the story is that absolutely the first Beatle that Yoko approached was Paul.
Okay. And
on the IMDb website, they described the encounter as Yoko knocked on Paul's door and said, "We're collecting manuscripts for John Cage's birthday. Do you have any?" And basically Paul wasn't really keen to go down this road, so he pointed Yoko in the direction of John Lennon. But certainly Yoko targeted Paul initially, and then apparently she very much, well, I wouldn't go as far as say stalked, but she made constant contact with John after that.
Derek Shelmerdine, it's been an absolute pleasure having you back on the Mop Tops and the King. And I'd like to remind everyone to check out your book, Rock'n'Roll Unraveled. You can find it on Amazon and anywhere else you can buy books. Derek, what song can we send you off with today relating to John's Lost Weekend?
Yeah, I think the Surprise, Surprise, Sweet Bird of Paradox. If you listen to the lyrics there, it really is a love song to May Pang.
It will be my pleasure. Derek, thank you so much for coming on the Mop Tops and the King, and I look forward to the next time you're on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Good to speak to you again, Steve. Cheers.